Okay, let me just say a little bit about same-sex marriage, and then we'll open it up for questions on this. What I want to do is evaluate the two of the most common arguments for same-sex marriage, and then throw out an idea that is gaining some strength in this discussion. I'm not persuaded that that's the position we ought to hold, but I think it has a lot to be said for it in general. Okay? Now, theologically, I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, it would be hard, I think, for the Bible to be much clearer that marriage is to be between one man and one woman. Okay? Now, granted, as we've talked about before, there were exceptions to this in the Scripture. Right? We've said before that levirate marriage remember back from the book of Ruth, that could have put someone into a situation of polygamy. Right? The law didn't mandate that all kinsmen redeemers had to be single guys. Okay? And that, but just in general, the fact that polygamy was allowed is not particularly relevant to this, but the fact that you could end up in a polygamous situation by obeying the law puts it in a little bit different light. But the general norm reaffirmed in both testaments is that marriage is to be between one man, one woman, intended to be both permanent and monogamous. Okay? This is where the prophets appeal to the Genesis account when they describe idolatry as spiritual adultery. I think really strongly suggest that the norm for marriage is one man, one woman. Okay? Now, hopefully that's not breaking news theologically. Okay? Now, whether that should be the law of the land is a very different question. Okay? Unless you are, have some sort of, view of Christian ethics that resembles theonomy, or where if you believe something like a theocracy, where the law of God ought to be the law of the land, sort of without legislative debate. And thankfully, in my view, there are not many of those folks around today. But we have traditionally, we have seen the biblical view of marriage as also being a good thing to promote in the culture at large. And it's only in about the last 25 years that sort of overwhelming historical consensus has come under debate. Right? Now, just so you'll know, just so you're aware, we mentioned last time the Yale historian John Boswell. Remember who I suggested if you wanted to read a little bit more on the attempt to integrate the New Testament with an affirmation of homosexuality. Remember that Boswell's work was considered to be one of the authoritative sources for this. Well, he has also written historically on same-sex marriage, and he's actually made the argument that sometime prior to the Middle Ages, between the Church Fathers and the medieval times, that the Catholic Church actually had a period where they sanctioned same-sex marriage. Now you can read, I forget the title, I'll get the title of the book for you. That volume has come under considerably more criticism than his earlier one. And most people think historically there's not much in it that stands up to scrutiny. It does appear historically that the consistent witness, not only of most religious groups, maybe Mormons accepted, and most cultures has been to affirm the sanctity of marriage. The family could have gotten quite a bit, it could have become quite extended due to sort of culture and geography. But for the most part, the basic family unit has been protected by most cultures and most religious traditions. There's a very strong historical precedent that's just recently been challenged. Okay? And we have maintained, particularly in the West, and explicitly since the Victorian era, that marriage was stabilizing, civilizing, and it was good for society because it put the procreation of children into a stable context, essentially. Okay? All of that has come under challenge in the last 25 years. And the arguments for same-sex marriage are the tip of the spear that is forcing a redefinition of family. Okay? Now, I've actually heard some people suggest that this actually began in roughly the 1930s with the advent of artificial contraception. And that by separating, watch out, that's valuable property, that by separating sex, marriage, and procreation, the door opened to virtually everything we see today. Right? Now that by itself, which we'll come to in a few minutes, is not necessarily a good argument against birth control. But that's a fact. And I think our theological reflection on contraception, particularly in non-Catholic circles, followed the trend instead, the technology instead of preceding it. We largely responded and shaped our views and rethought our theology on this largely in response to the advent of artificial contraception. Right? So the arguments for same-sex marriage are, if you could, once you sort of get rid of all the ad hominem arguments that it constitutes, that it's hateful, it's homophobic, when in reality it's neither of those things. I'd want to be clear about this. I do think that this is a good example of how ad hominem arguments have dominated the discussion. Y'all familiar with that term? Excuse me. An ad hominem argument is when you attack the person, not the position. And by calling opponents of same-sex marriage hateful and homophobic, that is a classic ad hominem argument that's being made. Now, these ad hominem arguments happen to be very effective, and I think have gotten the focus off of the issue and more onto the person or the group that is making the case. And I see a lot of groups that have been, a lot of potential opponents of same-sex marriage laws that have just decided to keep their head down and not go public with this. And we've, by the Rosemead, I think, has been at risk of having their APA accreditation removed. Our philosophy program was named in American Philosophical Association set of documents that wanted to deny us the opportunity to use the Jobs for Philosophers network, both to post jobs and to recruit from. Neither of those things have gone anywhere so far, but the threat of that is real, and more recent attempts to try and get access to the donors years for the campaigns to defeat same-sex marriage laws, thankfully, those are still being kept private, but there are legal challenges to keeping those private, which in my view will have a chilling effect on free speech if that's allowed to be public, because then once those names are allowed to be public, then they will be targeted as being hateful and homophobic. Yeah.
The most recent ruling, I believe, by at least the three-judge panel on the 9th has ruled in favor of opening up that information.
Yeah, my best understanding is at present that it's not done. At present, it's still private.
Well, because that ruling isn't final.
Right.
But if it becomes final,
then all bets are off on that. But at this moment, those are still being held privately, though somewhat loosely in anticipation of what the courts may decide on that. Okay? So my point of this, there's a huge ad hominem component to this that I think it threatens the place of civil discourse, and it's not a good example of how democracy ought to be working. Okay? Now, part of the response to the advocates of same-sex marriage is, one, to admit that it's actually been a very effective strategy to silence their opponents. But for another is to I think you can make the counterclaim that if you take a public position, which is what a change in the law sort of fundamentally is, it's an intrinsically public position, then you ought to expect public criticism for that. And to basically to compartmentalize all of your critics as hateful, evil, and homophobic is, for one, it's clearly misleading. But in a lot of cases, it's just flat out wrong. Now, granted, there are some opponents of same-sex marriage who are hateful and homophobic, but the majority are not. The majority are simply committed to saying that the proponents of same-sex marriage are wrong about this. Okay? And there's nothing hateful about saying you're wrong, okay? And respectfully disagreeing and offering arguments for why you respectfully disagree. And offering those arguments publicly in order to influence how laws are crafted. All of that is a part of the public deliberation, which really until the abortion debate, we maintained with some degree of civility. And you could probably argue that the civil rights movement was a little different than that too. But this discussion, I think, has upped the ante a bit on the incivility of the way the discussion is being handled. Okay? So there are two primary arguments are being made to support same-sex marriage being law. Okay? One is an argument from autonomy, that it's my life, it's my right to choose who to spend my life with. And if I want to choose to love, a man, or a woman wants to choose to love a woman and commit herself to her, then we should have, gays and lesbians and transgenders should have the right to do that. That it's an extension of the idea that you have the right to order your life as you see fit. Now, this is a very powerful basis in our culture to justify a whole lot of things. This is what justifies laws permitting abortion. This is what also is the attempt to justify laws that would permit assisted suicide and euthanasia. The idea that that you are the master of your own fate and have the right to order your life as you see fit and with whom you see fit is at the heart of this discussion about same-sex marriage. And if I want to be able to marry somebody else, I should be able to marry whomever I choose. Right? Now you can see this bleeds in a little bit to the fairness argument too. Because you could say, you could grant autonomy for everything that I just sort of ticked off there except for marriage. Okay? And so it sort of bleeds into the second, the fairness and the discrimination argument. But let's look at the autonomy piece here for just a second. What's troubling to me about the appeal to autonomy is that appeal doesn't stop at same-sex marriage. There's no reason that the same argument can't be extended to multiple marriages. In fact, it's completely arbitrary to say that if on the basis of autonomy that you have to limit yourself to marrying one person. Okay? And there are some jurisdictions in Europe that are already doing a here come the brides, plural, giving it legal sanction. And I'd say it's generally a well-kept secret today that most of the prosecution of fundamentalist Mormons is not for polygamy, it's for welfare fraud, which is often necessary to support, for one man to support multiple family units. I mean, it shouldn't be a huge surprise that there'd be the temptation to that. But my understanding is that, at least in Utah and Arizona, that officials are going after what they consider to be the more egregious offense, which is basically the theft from the state, and turned somewhat of a blind eye toward the phenomena of polygamy. Right? Now that's not universal, and when there is sexual abuse, they go after them very hard. Right? But the assumption that there would be either of those things can't always be made. Right? So that's in how it's treated and how it's prosecuted. But I think they're recognizing an important point, that once you open the door to same-sex marriage on the basis of autonomy, it opens the door to a lot of other things. In fact, there's no reason it couldn't open the door to various forms of incest, assuming, of course, this is under the assumption that the parties were adults and consenting. Right? Now, there are a lot of incestuous relationships that are not consensual. Right? And the proponent of same-sex marriage could actually support an autonomy argument and and make a very good case that those non-consensual incestuous relationships are all clearly wrong. Right? So, but assuming that the participants are adults and consenting, there's no reason on the basis of autonomy why you couldn't have a push for legalizing a variety of incestuous, what we've typically called incestuous relationships. Yeah.
You mentioned some legal sanctions in Europe.
Yes, in the Netherlands, there are some states in the Netherlands actually recognize the legality of multiple marriages. There was a piece, you want to read about this, there's a piece in the Weekly Standard some time ago entitled, "Here Come the Brides." And it was a very interesting discussion of that autonomy piece. Right? So it seems to me that there's a logical slippery slope, which what that means is that there's no idea that you can put forward that might stop that slide down the slope. And it shouldn't be a huge surprise that we've already seen the extended application of autonomy to other types of marriages besides same-sex and traditional marriage. Okay? So I'd want to be real careful about how that we don't concede too much with the argument from autonomy. All right? We all clear on that? Okay. Now, the fairness argument is, I think, a little bit trickier to address. And the fairness argument sort of goes like this, that it's discriminatory, it's unfair to say that the institution of marriage with all its benefits can only be given to monogamous heterosexual couples. It's just unfair to deny same-sex couples the benefits that opposite-sex couples get. Right? Now, I think part of the response to that is to spell out, well, exactly what benefits are you referring to? And to make the proponent of same-sex marriage be clear about what benefits are being denied same-sex couples at present. Okay. Under most states' civil union laws, the benefits of marriage are available to same-sex couples. We just don't call it marriage. So about the only benefit, it seems to me, that's being denied to same-sex couples is the symbolic affirmation that comes from marriage. Right? Now, in the states where civil union laws don't, or in the states where civil union laws provide uneven benefits, I think that's a problem that needs to be addressed. I think it's wrong that same-sex couples used to not have the same decision-making authority for each other that husband and wife did when it came to medical situations. Now, most civil union laws have remedied that disparity. Now, the one thing I'm not as clear about are the tax benefits, which there may still be a tax benefit or a marriage penalty. I'm not exactly sure which, but I need to clarify that. But civil unions, it seems to me, should provide all of the same tangible benefits that marriage laws do. So that in terms of the way that couples are treated, in terms of their specific benefits, I think the fairness argument is a little bit harder to maintain. Right? Now, what that leaves is the symbolic value, sort of the cultural symbolic value that comes with marriage. Okay? And I think that that's still a substantial affirmation today. Though it is true, we need to admit that about 2 or 3 years ago, demographically, the number of households that were headed by a single unmarried adult, became the majority for the first time. Now, typically, when people assign symbolic value to something, that's almost like a backhanded compliment. For example, in all the discussions about embryo research and stem cell research, there's been huge emphasis on ascribing symbolic value to the embryos as a source of life. And we ascribe symbolic value to fetuses as being sort of representative of the potential of the unborn. And most people, I think, rightly see through that assignment of symbolic value as being, at best, perfunctory, and at worst, hypocritical. In my own view, I think it's hypocritical to say that embryos have symbolic value when after 2 weeks or within the first 2 weeks development, any kind of research we want can be done on them that destroys them, or they can otherwise be thrown away. I mean, I think you're playing a semantic game there with that idea of symbolic value. But here, in the discussion of marriage, the symbolic value of marriage now has really significant value to the people who want to claim it. Now, whether or not denying the label of marriage is unfair or not, I think depends on the value that's placed on the term marriage. If the benefits are the same, it seems to me that the culture has the right, if that's the majority opinion politically, to decide what types of arrangements they want to have symbolic affirmation and what types they don't. It's not as clear to me that that's fundamentally unfair to say that one group has the designation of marriage and the other ones do not, that incestuous relationships would not have the designation of marriage, or that multiple marriages would not have that designation, whatever the arrangement might be. It seems to me to restrict that to one while providing the same benefit, the same tangible benefits, I'm not convinced is fundamentally unfair. Was that so 5 minutes ago?
Well, no, I mean, it's just, I'm wondering what benefit they're denied. I mean, I'm really struggling with that. Maybe the benefit of having to go through a civil divorce when they break up.
No. No, I think the symbolic affirmation actually means a lot. But I think we need to, at the least, I think we need to distinguish between tangible benefits and symbolic ones. Because it's not clear to me, and if there are disparities in some state laws, I think they ought to be fixed. But it's not clear to me that opposite-sex couples are treated differently than same-sex couples are in terms of tangible benefits. The symbolic affirmation, I'll grant you, is different. But we make symbolic affirmations of all sorts of things that are not fundamentally discriminatory. Right? We have, you can't rent a car until you're 25. I think that largely a symbolic thing that says at 25 you're of a mature age that we want to take a risk. The law doesn't prohibit that. It's not considered to be unfair, right? I mean, we could multiply those. I mean, there are all sorts of laws that make symbolic distinctions that we don't consider fundamentally unfair. All right, let me just, that's enough on that. Do you have, what questions do you have on this? Yeah.
Well, just the symbolic thing, it just seems like the majority rules are a power struggle. What we want to call marriage, symbolically. So from their view, it's unfair because all you guys wanted marriage to be this, and you're calling it that. It's unfair to us. we want to call it. It just seems like a power struggle.
Well, I think in terms of public policy, it is. I mean, but that's how we work things out in a democratic plurality. So I say, yeah, if it's, yeah, I mean, I say, for groups that want to call it what they want, I mean, they can call it, I mean, you can call your relationship whatever you want, but if you ask for the force of law to sanction it, then that's a public discussion. And the public has an interest in that. I mean, if you don't want to invoke the law to recognize that, then I think you call it whatever you want.
That just seems to be the emotional fight thing.
Right. No, that's
The
right.
legal recognition.
That's right.
Medically speaking, I'm not aware of any sort of limitation, as I was assisting the doctors, that would suggest that it's not proportionate in terms of rights for, either side, the traditional marriage versus, the other arrangement. I'm not sure.
Right. And that's because the laws have changed on
The
that.
doctors are just evaluating.
Right.
It primarily deals with your advance directive. And
Right,
what
that's
you
right.
decided, and they take it from that point.
That's
So I'm
right.
not sure of any limitation at all.
I don't think there is. That's because the law's been changed. Yeah.
And that's the law in California. But as you pointed out, the law in California is different than laws in other states. And that may be one of the benefits of having the word marriage applied to it. Because if you have a couple that is married in one state, they go to another state, and there may be some variations, minor variations, but marriage is recognized across the board in all states, even though marriage is governed by state laws. It's not a federal
Right.
concept. But so that may be the only thing. But that's something that can be addressed really easily.
Right. And should be.
Legislatively.
It should be. Yeah, the laws may be different in Missouri, or Tennessee or wherever else. But I think those are disparities that ought to be fixed. Okay. Let me suggest another view that is out there, and I just throw this out for you to think about. Be honest, this appeals to some of my libertarian inclinations. But it's the idea that the government ought to be out of the marriage business altogether. And that marriage, the presumption there is that marriage is fundamentally a Judeo-Christian thing with religious roots. And that churches and religious organizations should be able to set whatever rules they want for sanctioning marriage, but that the tangible benefits that are given to marriage, as opposed to single adults, could also be considered unfair, and that irrespective, government shouldn't be in the place of deciding the definition of marriage. Proponents of this would actually say that's usurping what is fundamentally the church's business. Now, I'll grant you, applying this is a fairly radical proposition, which would mean the state couldn't require marriage licenses. In fact, you wouldn't have to be licensed in order to perform marriages. All that would have to happen is you would be recognized by your church or whatever governing body there is for your denomination. There would be no marriage penalty in the tax laws. and no benefit to that category where it would be married filing jointly for your taxes. It would essentially be just everybody on their own or joint. So I mean, it would undo a lot of the institution of marriage. Now, whether that's a plausible view at the end of the day, I think is still up for debate. And I certainly would not want this to be seen as sort of abdicating, the fight to affirm marriage and how important that is. But that's you will hear this position more frequently from people who are opposed to the morality of same-sex marriage, but essentially argue that it shouldn't be in the public debate at all. I think this is somewhat analogous to the view that I'm personally opposed to abortion, but don't think the law should prohibit it.
But doesn't that also somewhat undermine the argument that marriage, or that saying that heterosexual marriage provides a familial basis upon which to build society and culture? I mean, isn't that
Right.
what gives the government an interest in marriage?
Traditionally, yes. And so here's where I think
If you take that position, doesn't that also carry out to, then you can have any church that wants to can sanction same-sex marriage?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Now, probably what that would also do, frankly, is to take government out of that business. You'd probably also be taking government out of the business of religion, so that you couldn't either reward or penalize religious organizations with tax exemption because of their view on this. This is actually the way the church functions in some parts of the world. And when I was last summer in Australia, in the church, there's no tax deduction for charitable contributions. But there's also no prohibition on the church being a business. In fact, the largest church in Melbourne owns 2 solid city blocks of the choicest real estate in the heart of the business district. And they make enough money off of that to fund their operations and virtually every other Presbyterian church in their state. Now, you would lose your tax exemption status in a hurry, if you did that in the U.S. But as far as they're concerned, they view that as a much better model for doing this. So my point is that might take the government out of the business of at least providing tax benefits for religious organizations.
What about any other church?
Well, it might, those that bleed over into religious, it could do the same thing for that.
Well, but then you'd have that same fairness argument.
Yeah, you would. No, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So it raises some complicated questions. I'm not convinced that it's the best way to do this. But you need to be aware I think that's an arguable position. I'm not sure it's the one that ought to carry the day, because I still think the arguments justifying same-sex marriage in the law are not as compelling as the public is led to believe.
Well, as long as the public is closed down, as long as the debate is closed down by the ad hominem argument.
Which is basically what's That seems to be a lot of the strategy.
Right. Well, and that's part of the fairness argument. The fairness argument is, to a great extent, ad hominem.
True, it doesn't have to be, but there is,
It tends
yeah.
that way, and you get better sound bites that way.
well, no doubt about that. Okay, other questions?
Kind of comment question, just thinking in terms of practical ministry. You know, we want to vote right and keep the law to protect marriage and so forth, but one-on-one with an individual, this is, you can just imagine how fiery and emotional this will be of a conversation. You know, I have the right, it's unfair, and I have the right to do what I want to do. And we're going to come back with the two arguments you gave is, what stops, to the autonomy argument, what stops from going beyond same-sex, and how do we protect, what benefits are you referring to? Those seem to be more what's good for society kind of things. So to the individual, you're going to be wrestling with that. It would just seem like practically it would be a successful interaction to get the person to see that as much as I want to be married and have that institution for the good of society, it's probably not.
That's a tough sell. See, I'm not holding out much hope for civil discourse on that. I think we've already passed that. And I think, I think this is a case of, my mind's made up, don't confuse me with the facts.
At the bottom line, the argument of Christians in this is that, to a certain extent, that the relationship is predicated on sinful behavior. And any time you accuse someone of committing a sin, you're going to put them on the defensive, and that's going to raise that emotional tenor of the discourse.
Right.
So I think Joseph has a really good point. One-on-one, you have to be prepared for a potentially heated exchange and hurt feelings.
No, that's right. Which is different, I think, is a little different than the discussion on homosexuality in general. Because there, I think you can affirm the attraction without justifying the behavior. With the law, there's no such distinction that can be made. Okay, shall we move to birth control? Not really? You guys not want to have this conversation?
Back to homosexuality a little bit, or do we have
Sure.
much else to cover? I forgot that the law that was passed about education, homosexuality, something.
Yeah, SB 48.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. SB 48, and a topic came up at church, and pastor was talking about homosexuality from the pulpit, and the conclusion that was made was that being a practicing homosexual is a sin, and continuous practice in this does not equate him to being a Christian, and because he cannot be a Christian, he cannot be saved. And I was just
I
really
don't
wrestling
know. I
with
don't think
that.
that's true.
No, okay.
I would, it's just in general. In general, I'd want to leave questions of eternal destiny like that ultimately to God. I don't think we are well positioned, unless somebody actually denies the gospel message. I don't think we're well positioned to make that assessment about someone's heart, where their life is. Now, I think I think if you reframe the question, it's easier to answer. And I think is it possible for someone to live an openly homosexual lifestyle and still faithfully follow Christ? If you phrase it like that, then the answer to that clearly is no, which I think is sort of what we're after.
Right. But someone who is struggling with that practice?
Different. That's totally different, I think.
That's an issue of
That
grace.
opens up.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right.
And I think that changes God's attributes.
I think that's totally different. Yeah. It's, if it's a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, or, some combination of that, that's completely different. Yeah, I mean, I would never condemn someone who's in the middle of a struggle.
Even if it's a daily struggle.
Yeah, because I think for somebody to admit that this is a battle that I happen to be losing at the moment, but I think that's different than the person who says, there's nothing wrong with what's going on. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
I mean, if I was just going to jump into the argument, the discussion as well, is that, somebody who has a problem with telling the truth, somebody who has a problem with pornography, somebody who has
Same
a
thing.
problem with any type
Yeah.
of sin, it's still a daily battle.
It is. I suspect, most of us have daily battles. It's just they aren't that one, for the most part. Okay. Now, this moment has come. It's unavoidable. All right. So, I don't have slides on this, but I would refer you to, there's about 161 to 166 in here. I will scan this and post it for you. But I was with him this week at ETS, and he was giving and he says he gave a paper on contraception, theological justification for contraception, which I think goes a little bit, is more developed than this. And then when he sends it to me, if he does it before the end of the semester, I'll make that available to you. Also, I also got into one of the guys on the panel that I was on Wednesday morning is a very staunch Roman Catholic. In fact, the joke was he was in the lobby with all the ETS participants, and he was sort of jokingly freaked out because I've never been among this many Protestants before in my life. But we had about an hour and a half long discussion about contraception, and he basically holds the official Catholic teaching that no artificial contraception is ever allowed. So anyway, I guess that's sort of in the back of my mind as we're talking about this. I think we have to distinguish between 2 types first. Birth control that is contraceptive and birth control that is abortifacient. Now, those are 2 different things. The abortifacient ones are things that either prevent implantation or they expel an implanted embryo from the womb. So RU486 would be something that would do that. IUDs are abortifacient. Some, not all, but some birth control pills are also abortifacient. Other types of birth control are strictly contraceptive. They either prevent ovulation or they prevent sperm and egg from getting together. Right? Now, let's bracket the abortifacient ones for just a second, because I think it's probably not as tricky to agree that the abortifacient ones are much more problematic. Okay? Now, how the pill fits in there, I realize, is the most interesting question to most people on this. But let's hold that for just a minute. The contraceptive part really begs the more intrinsic question about birth control at all. So here's sort of the idea. If children are a gift from a good God who has our best interest always at heart, what possible justification could there be for birth control? Aren't we saying to God, sort of, thanks but no thanks to your additional good gifts? Amen? Amen? Or oh me. We do. For example.
For example, I don't know, maybe God has provided for us to have a particular type of job, or is leading us in towards a particular field of work, and we battle against that and go do something else.
With God's blessing.
Under God's love, we may have.
It's a different.
That's true.
That's different.
That's true.
Yeah.
I trust God with my health, and I trust God with my time of dying, but I still put a seatbelt on when I get in the car.
Okay.
Because even though I trust Him that if I were to get in an accident, that His plan wouldn't be marred.
That's
I don't want to
okay.
take unnecessary precautions.
Okay. All right. Because you have, this is the point that Hollinger brings out. I think there's a competing, or it's not competing, I don't think, but a balancing principle that we are also called to be good stewards of the gifts and resources that God has given us. Right? Now, let's be really clear. I don't know if I said this earlier, but the be fruitful and multiply mandate has already been fulfilled. Right? The earth is full. We pulled that off some time ago. In fact, I think you could probably make an argument that by the end of the book of Genesis, that mandate was considered completed. Okay? Now, the reason for that was connected with the mandate to effectively exercise dominion over creation. Procreation and dominion were always connected. Okay? So I don't think you can say that just because children are a gift, that the obligations of stewardship go out the window. Okay? Couples are responsible for stewarding their resources, and they are responsible for stewarding their parenting obligations toward their children. Okay? None of that's inconsistent with seeing children as God's good gift. Okay? Here's the other part of the sort of the argument against contraception is that it treats sexual relations differently than the way God designed them. Okay? This is where the Catholic view holds that sex is sort of fundamentally procreative in nature, or at least what they call the unitive, what we would call the one flesh. The unitive and procreative elements always have to go together. Okay? Now, this is the other side of the coin from that which we talked about during the reproductive technologies session. Right? That all ringing a bell? Okay? Now, just biologically, most of a woman's monthly cycle is considered closed. The window is considered closed for procreation. Right? I mean, Hollinger, I love the way he puts this. The fact that God created the natural female reproductive cycle with only a small window in the month in which conception can occur demonstrates that sex is for more than procreation. Right? I think he's right about that. And I think that you could also add to this the idea of menopause, that at menopause there's a natural separation of the unitive and procreative components. I told my Catholic friend over lunch on Wednesday that the idea of being open to procreation after menopause is meaningless. That's different than being open to procreation before that. Right? Even though most of the the days of the month the window's closed. Right? And so it seems to me that there's a God-ordained separation of the unitive and procreative components, and so if God allows them, or if God actually separates them, there doesn't seem to be anything intrinsically wrong with human beings separating them too. And that's where my Catholic buddy really pushed back, because he really didn't like that of human beings separating those. But again, intrinsically, and the method that's used makes a difference too, because you have other values to protect, such as the sanctity of human life, which rules out abortifacient types of contraception. Right? Now, you missed all the good stuff here. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Actually, you came in just when we're hitting the good stuff. Now, a lot of the discussion is over the pill and whether it has an abortifacient capacity to it. Right? Some pills clearly do. By that, what I mean by that is that their primary intention is to prevent ovulation. But they have a backup mechanism that also makes the uterus inhospitable for implantation. Okay? Not that it can't, but it stacks the deck against it. Okay? Now, there are some pills that don't have that abortifacient capacity. And we urge couples, speak to your physician and be clear about that. Be clear about what your values are. I've got a colleague that I met at ETS who has a physician in his church who has spelled out a little more detail on this. And he's sending me this stuff. And again, if it comes before the end of the term, I'll pass that along to you guys. But it is possible to have a pill that is not abortifacient. Right? Now, the other way to think about this, and I'm not sure if I'm totally persuaded by this. Remember when we talked about assisted suicide and the end of life? We made reference to the law of double effect. Right? Remember that? Please nod your head. Yes, something reasonably positive. Right? And what we meant by that is that a moral action that has an anticipated but unintended side effect, right, that's a problem, doesn't undermine the morality of the action in the first place. Remember, we used the example where if a pregnant woman has aggressive uterine cancer that has to be treated, right? Treating the cancer is the right thing, even though we anticipate but don't intend the demise of the unborn child. Okay? We said the same thing about the end of life, that if we give a degree of pain medication with the intention to treat pain, and it has the anticipated but unintended side effect of shortening their life, not killing them, but shortening their life, that was also okay. Apply that to this. Breastfeeding has the same effect on the womb that some of these pills do. Breastfeeding has an abortifacient effect. But every mother who breastfeeds is not intending that her womb become inhospitable should she become pregnant. Okay? Now, it's not, unheard of, but it is unusual for a woman to become pregnant while she's breastfeeding. But we would not say that even conceding the abortifacient capacity that there's anything wrong with breastfeeding. Right? So that, assuming here that we affirm that contraception is a good thing, or at least is not, we would not say there's anything wrong with that. Even a method of contraception that may also be abortifacient could fall under the heading of the law of double effect. You know, I'm not completely persuaded of that, because my understanding biologically is that when a woman conceives, once she conceives, then the abortifacient effect of breastfeeding is gone. So it's still not clear to me how all that works, but I think in principle there's an argument to be made that even if you concede the abortifacient capacity of the pill, that may not be a problem either. Now, I'm not done working on that, but I think that's something I think we ought to consider. And I mean even if there were not pills that are not abortifacient, I still think that's worth considering. Okay? So I don't think there's any problem per se with contraception. And I think the theological principle of stewardship is a very, very important one. And that I don't think you can make the argument that sex has procreation as its primary end. I would say that's a unique end, but not its primary one. Sex has multiple purposes, all of which are legitimate ends in and of themselves. Okay? And Hollinger, if you want to read a little bit more, his beginning chapter here, beginning chapters, is really, really good stuff, laying theological foundations here. So anyway, questions on that before we stop here? Is that clear as mud?
Well, how are you arguing stewardship?
Well,
We're saying that the earth can't take any more people because it's going to do something.
no, not necessarily. It doesn't have to be a global, though frankly, I wouldn't be opposed to making that argument in some parts of the world. In other parts, it's a little tougher to maintain that because most of the West is actually experiencing just the opposite. But in the developing world, particularly if the advent of something akin to market capitalism is not forthcoming, then I think a good argument can be made for that on a broader scale. I'm making the case more on a family basis, that the families are responsible for stewarding their resources effectively as well. And I think what that looks like for different people and different families may actually be quite different. I'm not sure there's an absolute level standard.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.